This podcast is brought to you by PLI, the Practicing Law Institute, committed to providing essential legal resources to the law school community. For more information, visit pli.edu/law school.
Hello, everyone. I'm Anastasia Boyko, and I am the host of PLI's How to Navigate Law School podcast. How to Navigate Law School is your podcast guide to unlocking the hidden knowledge and practical skills needed to succeed in law school. We connect students with valuable insights from experienced professionals, decompress law school's unwritten rules, and create a supportive community empowering students to confidently create their future. Hello and welcome to PLI's How to Navigate Law School. I am Anastasia Boyko, and today I am joined by Jeff Lamont. We will be talking about money. A lot of decisions that are being made by law students center around considerations that are financial. And so today we're going to delve into a little bit of that and the way that lawyers feel about money and how they make decisions around it. So welcome, Jeff. It's so wonderful to have you.
Anastasia, thanks for having me. One of the things that I'm really trying to do these days is reach out to younger people and help them avoid the mistakes that some of us made as older people. So thank you.
I think your background is uniquely helpful in this discussion as someone who works with a lot of lawyers and their financial planning needs. And so I think your lens is one that can provide some really valuable insights to law students or folks who are considering law school and trying to make some decisions around their finances. And so to sort of get us started, I'll say a lot of students, when they speak about what they want to do in their careers after law school, will speak about debt burden and financial considerations. A lot of lawyers who I speak to who may not be as fulfilled or considering a pivot oftentimes bring up compensation, right? And sort of how they're thinking about managing their lives. And so I'd love to first take a step back and ask how you came, to the work that you're doing primarily with lawyers around financial planning, so folks can have a sense of what your lens is toward this.
Well, it's kind of funny, but one of the things that a lot of people don't know is I wanted to be a lawyer. When I went into university, that was my first thought, was that I wanted to become a lawyer. And in third year, as I was getting ready to register for the LSATs, I had an opportunity to go play baseball in Europe. So I chose that path over law school, thinking that I could always come back. Now, when I did come back from playing baseball, I joined my dad, who had been in the financial services industry for, at that point, about 25 years. And as I started working with him, I was thinking, well, this isn't bad. I think I could do this. And so I started working with my dad in 1998, go figure, a long time ago. And one of the things that he did is he was working with a couple of large law firms in Toronto, working with the partnership on a couple different strategies that were meant to help them with their financial planning. And the joke of it all is that he actually didn't like dealing with lawyers. So here I was, 23 years old, and he said, listen, why don't you deal with them? And I was scared shitless. Won't lie. I had no idea what to do. But here I was sitting with people that were 15, 20 years older than me, helping them with their finances. And that was my first foray into dealing with lawyers. They respected me. Even though I was 23, so like I said, 15, 20 years younger than them, I didn't feel like I was being looked down upon. So there's instant rapport, and a lot of those people that I started with 28 years ago are still clients today. So I've just been working deeper and deeper with lawyers over the last few years.
That's amazing. Are there any patterns you've noticed about our lawyer personas and the way that we think about money and money's role in our careers?
Yeah, it's funny because I think that the biggest trapping is that, especially if people end up in big law, is they make so much of it so quickly. So in Canada here, a starting associate at a big law firm makes about $125, $130 plus bonus. I know if you're in the big cities in the US, that can be quite double that. And so you're talking about young people that are making considerable amounts of money right up front. And the biggest problem I find, Anastasia, is that they haven't given it any thought prior to that. It's kind of like winning the lottery. All of a sudden, somebody plops a bunch of money in front of you. You have no idea how to handle it. And so I think a lot of the habits that really kind of befuddle a lot of lawyers later in life actually started back when they were in law school and early associate. So I think that's the biggest thing I see, is that the bad habits usually started long before law. Once they get into practicing, the money is just coming. It's just like a hamster wheel. So they know, next year I know I'm going to make $25,000, $50,000 more than I did this year. So their spending starts to change with that, in the anticipation of that quite often. So long before they get their bonus or long before they get their increase, they've already spent the money. And then from there, unfortunately, it's just a problem that snowballs, really.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds a lot like there's not much strategic planning around it, right? Like there may be some financial principles that folks get in law school, but as they're moving through their careers, they're not necessarily approaching their financial planning with a strategy in mind, right? And you and I talked about this when we first spoke. For me, I was an immigrant who went to law school as a first gen professional. My mom and I came to the US with no money and 2 suitcases. And so after graduating law school and going into big law, like those were very large paychecks that I was getting, but I was very mindful with sort of the mentality that I had around money, which is a scarcity one, right? Like money was
Yep.
security, debt was bad. And I was in law firms both my first year and second year summer during law school. And I had used all of that money toward my law school loans, as I had chosen to go to law school somewhere to forego a scholarship elsewhere and pay full price. But I like it, the debt burden felt so heavy for me that I was trying to reduce it in real time and minimize any sort of increase with interest. And so after I graduated, I was trying to put as much as I could toward my debt burden so I could ease that. Because for me, my driving value was freedom. And I felt like the debt reduced my freedom and my autonomy to make choices, right? So as we talk, right, that is my value system. But I wonder, what kind of value systems you've seen with different folks, or how you would encourage students to think about their value systems around money while they're in law school.
Yeah, as you said, with your situation, Anastasia, a lot of people don't think that far. They don't think that deeply into where they come from in money sense. When I often sit down with young people, especially as they come out of law school and they're just starting their career, I'll ask them about how they grew up with money. Was it from a scarcity mindset? Did they have an abundant mindset? Did they ever have to worry about debt? But a lot of young people coming out of school have no idea. They've never given any of that any thought. So being mindful enough to know what to do with money is really difficult when you don't know really where you came from. And whereas you're much more aware of how you grew up and you're mindful of that, and you know that how that shaped your views on money today. A lot of people don't give that a lot of thought, or enough thought. And I think that's the first thing that people need to understand is, me as an example, I came from a fairly affluent background, so I never had to worry about anything through school. My deal with my parents was good. They paid for tuition and room and board, and I had to pay for books and all my extracurricular activities, we'll call it, which was fair. But growing up, I didn't have to think about it a whole lot. What I now realize at 50 is that I'm a spender by habit. I think that people are either a spender or a saver. That's first thing. I don't know why, but people fall into one of the two categories usually. And so everything that I do as a spender, an internal spender, has to be geared towards automation, has to be as easy and simplified as possible for me. And so I think really at the end of the day, anybody to be successful, like truly successful with their finances, they have to take a good hard look at where they came from and who they really are. And I think the questions you need to ask yourself is, do I come at money from an abundant mindset? Or is, like you said, is it from a scarcity mindset? Because really either one of those can drive you down a different course in how you should manage your finances.
Yeah, good question. What is success with money? Like, how would you define success for people with money?
It's funny because I just posted about that on LinkedIn the other day. Success is different to different people. And I think a big driving force, especially in the legal community, you look to your left, you look to your right, you see success through different windows. And I think that becomes very comparative. And I think that causes a lot of problems for a lot of young lawyers, is they're living through comparison. And as you and I both know, as they always say, comparison is the thief of joy. And it's true. I think that ultimately you need to come up with what success means to you. So as an example, the other day, I had a call with a young lawyer. He's 31 and he works big law. We were talking about what success meant for him. And I was expecting him to talk about cars and homes and vacations. And here he was, he said, I just want to be comfortable. That to him, he didn't want to make millions. He didn't come from a whole lot. He didn't want for anything, but he didn't come from a whole lot. So for him, he just wanted to live a comfortable life. Then I've got the other end of the spectrum where I go through that same question with somebody else and they'll say, well, I want to own a cottage and I want to own a ski chalet and I want to be able to travel the world and I want to have the fancy car. So success has to be your version of success, not somebody else's.
Yeah, that's such a good point, right? Because it intersects so much with purpose. And we talk on the podcast around, what should you do with your career and your degree? And a lot of it requires understanding yourself and what you want to get out of your life, and then setting up the sort of external structures of your life to facilitate that. Whereas I remember going through a decision matrix in law school about whether I wanted to be in private practice or whether I wanted to do something public interest or government related. But my decisions, because of my theory around money, were about having as many resources to unburden myself from the debt. And one of the things that I try to do with my students at Yale Law is try to give them examples of people who could tell their journeys, either through entrepreneurship or through career pivots, and how they looked at their finances and their monetary choices to be able to do that.
I always say to the young ones, listen, if you want to live like a partner now as a law student or as an early associate, you're going to end up living like a law student as a partner. So you got to get yourself straight now and live below your means as opposed to living for the life that you're working towards. And it's one of those things that a lot of them don't want to live like that. They think they worked hard enough that they deserve to live like that, but they deserve the fancy things. It's like, just dial it back a little bit so that you've got more tomorrow.
And what does it mean to you, right? What does that part mean to you in your life? Like, I was in New York City and I was going out often and I was spending money on luxury goods. And then I realized, I don't need to do that every night. I'm like, why do I have a dozen pair of luxury sunglasses? I don't even have time to wear them. This is probably not the smartest investment move, even though it was an emotional buying decision. And so I for myself figured out during those sabbaticals as I was trying to make pivots of I would like to go out max 2 to 3 times a week. And the rest of the time I'll make food, right? But I still get the joy of going out to eat. I don't want to deprive myself of the joy of enjoying food in a big city that has a lot of amazing restaurant options. But it doesn't have to be an everyday thing, multiple times a day thing. And I even had a habit where I track on a physical calendar how many times I'm going out to eat. In addition to, am I working out, right? Like, I have for my things, some of my core things that have to happen for me to be good and happy during the week. But going out to eat was one of them.
One of my roommates through school, he was a first year associate at one of the big firms downtown. He was at the bar, literally buying drinks for everybody. Money was going everywhere. And I'm like, Joe, what are you up to? He's like, oh, I'm working at ABC firm. He didn't last in the city. I think he was gone within a year. He couldn't handle life like that. Money was just everywhere. And yeah, just bad habits. I think the two biggest things though, that, and especially you talk about being in New York, Anastasia, I think the bigger the city that you're in, the more that this becomes an issue is lifestyle creep, right? You see the fancy restaurants, you see the fancy stores all the time. You look at the partner that you're working under, you look at maybe some of the more senior associates and you're like, I want to live that life, right? And you're making a fraction of what they are. So you're not there yet. You can't live like that yet. And I know that this is a major issue too with the young athletes is they come into the league, depending on what sport they're playing, and they're, again, making a fraction. Let's say they're making league minimum, right? Which is a fraction of the star that they're sitting two stalls away from. That guy's going out and eating at Ruth's Chris. He's going on the private jet to Vegas for the weekend. He's doing all those things. You can't do that when you're making 1/10 the guy next to you. But they live that lifestyle as though they're already making that money. And it's the same thing with the lawyers, right? They live the life like they've already made that money. And that's where they really fall into the trap.
And I don't want anybody in that situation. I have too many friends who have found themselves in that sort of prison. and they're making millions of dollars a year and they're paycheck to paycheck.
Anastasia, when I say that to people, that happens because I mean, I've dealt with a lot of partners that are making seven figures that are pretty much living hand to mouth. People that are making $50,000 or $100,000 a year, they can't even comprehend that. How can somebody make $2 million a year and be broke?
They spend too much on living, right? They spend too much on a fancy apartment. They spend too much on going out to dinner. They spend too much on luxury goods. They spend too much on vacations, right? Like they don't even realize how much money that they're hemorrhaging. I think there is a huge parallel to professional athletes and lawyers, right? Lawyers are professional athletes. They're mental professional athletes. And there's a lot in that psychology of, I deserve this. I've worked really hard versus, hey, I'm not telling you to not spend any of your money. I'm just telling you to organize yourself and be mindful and aware of where your money is going and decide whether or not that's a good allocation. Should you go spend $5,000 on a weekend in the Hamptons? Maybe, right? If you've allocated everything else in line. But if you haven't and you're not sure and you're like, yeah, I'll just pay for it with the next paycheck or put it on my card and I'll get points, but I'm not thinking about the APR. That's what I'm trying to get people out of, because I think it's very easy to be a professional athlete who may have not come from a lot of money and overuse it. And that's how you end up bankrupt when you're making millions of dollars. I think there is this pervasive feeling of keeping up with the Joneses, especially in big law, especially in big cities. And what I encourage students to do is ask yourself why, right? What is it about what you're seeing that's motivating you to try to have the same thing, and get underneath that emotion for yourself, because it is a reactive kind of emotion of, this person has, a Hampton summer house and they've got this luxury apartment on Fifth Avenue and they're wearing this kind of brand and they just had dinner at the Polo Club, right? Like all cool things perception wise, but ask yourself, why do you value that? And do you value it because other people at the firm value it, are impressed by it? There's a cachet around it. And does that mean that you need to have the same thing? I think there's a lot in the psychology about how we navigate our careers, and money is the tool that facilitates those choices. And so do you want to limit your choices in the future to be able to signal to your peers that you too can also do and afford these things? If on your deathbed, you're looking back and, man, I am so glad I spent all that money on that one thing to signal to that one person that I've made it, you're probably not going to have that line of thinking at the end of your life. And so get underneath why you're compelled to keep up with the Joneses and whether accumulating those things or experiences is worth it down the line.
I think you bring up a really good point, because money is a tool. And I think there's a lot of people that, especially when they start making real money, like good money, big law money, they think that's the end result. I want to make so much. I want to make this. I want to have this. But in reality, money should be looked at as a tool to get you the life that you want to lead, right? And you talk about freedom, you talk about having choice up the road. Would you rather have that $25,000 watch today, or would you rather be able to retire 5 years earlier because you saved that money in your 401k, right? And it compounded out to $1 million 20 years from now or 30 years from now. It's making those choices. And I think that there's a lot of people that don't realize that really money isn't the end destination. It's simply a tool to the life you want to lead. It can be a mind blow for people too, I think, sometimes.
Agreed. One of the fundamental things to do is, once you've figured out what's important to you, understanding what your cost of living is. What is your baseline cost? What do you need to spend money on to be baseline happy? Not exhilarated on a super yacht, but what does cost of housing look like? What does your food situation need to look like? How much entertainment do you want to consume? Do you have dependents? What are those cost needs? Like, what are you trying to save towards? How would you guide law students to begin to set up budgets toward those goals?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think there's a number of ways you can do it. One of the things that I did through university, even myself, is I wrote it down. I took a period of about a week, and even as I came out of school and I started living on my own, I took a week where I literally wrote down every penny that I spent. So if I spend $1 for a drink, $1 went down on the sheet. Now, there's obviously today, there's apps like Mint and that you can use to do that more effectively. But for me, I liked the idea of writing it down only because it was very conscious. Just saw it differently, I guess. And it's funny because I've encouraged people to do the same. Take a week and write down everything that you spend, from the Uber fee to your Uber Eats to drinks after work with your colleagues, and get a sense of how you actually spend the money. And then from there, you can start to identify what are those core things, like you said, and what are the important things, my rent, groceries, my cell phone bill, a debt repayment, or whatever the core things are to you. Figure out what those things are. And then you look at the second tranche, which is, okay, could I have lived without spending this money? Like, I can go and I can eat out every day, but do I need to spend $50 on a meal or $100 on a meal? Probably not. So it's ratcheting that back. So to your point, I think you need to get really clear on how you normally spend money and then start figuring out, okay, that's how I do spend money. How should I spend the money? Or how should I allocate the money? And I think that's again, it goes back to knowing yourself a little bit. I, unlike a lot of other financial people that you'll talk to, believe that, especially as a young professional, you work hard for your money. We all do, but young professionals work really hard for their money. You have to be able to enjoy it a little bit too. And I think that could be a mistake that a lot of financial advisors make, is they say, look, no lattes, eat at home, don't buy clothes, don't do this. You're going to burn out. And so for me, it's a matter of balance. I think you have to enjoy a little bit of it along the way. Both my parents died in their 60s. And so to me, I look at the future through a different lens, because people save for retirement. There's a chance that maybe you don't make it there. And so enjoying yourself along the way, whether you're an athlete, whether you're a plumber, a baker, or candlestick maker, you have to find time to enjoy yourself now too. So first is understanding where you are, and then figure out where you want to get to. I think it was Yogi Berra who said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. It's a matter of having that plan so that you know where you're trying to get to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think about my own journey, and when I was younger and in law school and after law school, I was sort of looking just sort of generically at the buckets of housing and savings and debt relief for myself. And I was trying to adjust to them more like amorphously. And then when I took my first sabbatical after I stopped practicing law, like, I really got into the weeds, exactly what you're saying. Write it down in the Excel spreadsheet. Now you can use amazing apps that track it for you, just to see how much you're actually spending and on what, because we have some sense of our behavioral patterns, a perception thereof, right? But like, until it actually gets written down, you don't realize how much you're spending on certain things. And you can look at one spending habit in isolation and not realize how it connects to everything else, or whether, like in a Marie Kondo way, right, whether it brings you joy to be able to do this, or whether you can change some of your habits to adapt for and facilitate other things that you want down the road. But I completely agree with you. Like, you really need to get a sense of how you behave with money without judgment, right? This is where I think a lot of people have an impediment toward it, is they actually don't want to know, because there's a lot of judgment that comes along with it, versus give yourself a month or a quarter, track how you're spending, and then decide whether that's how you want to spend your money after you've done, right, the simultaneous exercise of the why. What does money do for me? What am I trying to achieve long term? And then your habits can align a little bit closer to that.
Absolutely. And I think you mentioned a couple things there that are really important. One, you have to be very clear on where you want to get to, for sure. There's no question about that. But I think that one of the biggest things that people, especially in the legal community, kind of fall short on is they think about things in absolute dollars. Personally, I think it's the wrong way to deal with it. Only because if you're a W-2 employee where you're making X dollars today and you might get a 2 or 3% increase next year, it's a little bit different than being, especially in partnership, where the distributions can radically change from year to year. I try to talk to all my clients about looking at how they spend and how they save by percentages. Put 20% of what you're making aside. You don't have to do anything fancy with it. Just get used to putting it away. And I think that if a lot of students did that and looked at just putting away 20% of what they made on an annual basis, nobody would ever have to worry about money.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that 20%. Would you include an emergency fund in that 20%, or would you think about an emergency fund on top of that? And can you explain what an emergency fund is for listeners?
Yeah, the emergency fund is an interesting one, and the percentage becomes a little bit different. The amount that you would allot to the emergency fund, as an example, Anastasia, really, to me, is a case-by-case basis based on a couple of things. One, what is the debt load, right? Because my encouragement for all the clients that I work with is to be balanced between debt repayment and saving a little bit. It's not an either or, it's an and, right? So the percentage that you're allotting to savings or the percentage that you're allotting to debt repayment really depends on what that debt load is. So to me, if you can put even 5%, whether it's in that 20% or outside the 20% is about your own personal cash flow. But if you could put 5% away into an emergency fund, which is really all that is the most liquid cash that you can have available. So that if the proverbial poop hits the fan and you need money, whether it's your car breaks down, whether it's a medical issue, maybe you lose your job, whatever the case is, that you have a little side account of money of about 3 to 6 months of your living expenses. That's what you want to save, about 6 months worth, just in a savings account. Nothing fancy. Like I said, just put aside in the bank so that you can access it. So that if something happens, you're not reaching for the credit card to make that happen, because now that just becomes a spiral that can get way out of control.
Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because I think that the statistics, once you start going down the financial planning rabbit holes, you realize that most of us aren't really prepared for it, right? Like the majority of Americans can't afford an emergency $600 expense. And so it's one of those things that, like, it's just peace of mind to have an account that is sitting there for emergencies, whether you put into a regular savings account or a high yield savings account. It really is peace of mind, right? So if something comes up that you didn't predict, you've got some buffer there for that, right? Again, like, I think it frees up your decision making when you realize that you have a little bit of a safety net for yourself.
It's interesting because I had a young lawyer that I met last fall, so September, October. And this was an individual that had never saved a dollar. He had about $150,000 in terms of school debt. So he was told, his parents told him, his bank told him, everything that you make should be going towards that debt. Debt. The problem was, Anastasia, for him, is that left him nothing for those times that he ended up having to rely on credit cards basically all the time. And so he had a couple big expenses that he knew were coming up. And I said, well, how are you going to deal with that? And he said, well, my credit card. And I said, no. We're going to get this planned out. We're going to get you straightened around. And so for him, again, I can't stress enough, he never saved a dollar. So I had him go through a booklet that's basically like a cash flow analysis for the month. And I said, we're going to meet 28 days from today. And I want you to go through every expense, as we talked about just a few minutes ago. And we're going to talk about where we can find money for you to save. Jeff, I don't know if we can do it. I've got nothing. Like, I'm hand to mouth. And I said, no, we'll find something. A month later, we had another chat. He sent me the spreadsheet in advance. And as I went through it, Anastasia, the amount of just wasted money that came about. Anyways, long and short, we found that there was about $500 a month that he could safely, without totally affecting his life, start to save. So we started with that. So we did that for a couple months, and then we were able to ratchet it up, because I said we met monthly for the first little bit, and he found it easier and easier. So month 1, he hated me. Month 2, he goes, yeah, it's getting easier. Month 3, he came to me and said, okay, it's time to increase it a little bit. Now, keep in mind, his income hadn't changed yet, but his mindset had started to change. So having that little bit of extra money set aside was a good thing for him. It gave him encouragement, because then in March, he had something pop up unexpected with his car, and he needed a few $1,000s. He had it built up already, right? Like, he didn't have to put it on the credit card. So it was interesting because he was thankful that we had put the money aside. Now we fast forward a couple more months, and I talked to him just last week. He's had a bump up since we got started. but he's putting away about $1,500 a month now, which to use his words, it blows his mind that he's even doing that. His parents were shocked that he was doing that, but it's given him two things: encouragement, because he loves seeing the account now and seeing it going up each month, but he also likes how it makes him feel, because like you said, it gives him peace of mind that if something else pops up, he knows he's got some money set aside. So it really is a feel-good thing for yourself if you can get into the habit of saving.
Yeah. And I think a lot about the stereotype, right? That lawyers are scared of numbers. Now, I was a math minor and my mom is a math nerd and my dad is a math nerd. Like, I got a lot of people who aren't scared of numbers in my household. And we regularly talked about money and savings, probably more on the scarcity side than the abundance side, right? But I was very familiar with how to think about money. What I want to encourage law students to do and lawyers is to just have an open mind and learn some of these basic financial principles. Like, they're not as hard as law school. So just get yourself well versed in these things, and even thinking about things like interest rates, right? Looking at your loans and looking at your interest rate loans, and then simultaneously looking at potential investments that may return a higher rate of return. And so, albeit my personal, feeling around money and debt is to eliminate as much debt as possible. I was lucky to have a partner in my 20s who encouraged me to make investments, joint investments, individual investments that had a higher rate of return than at the time my government loans did. And so it gave me a lot of peace of mind as I was paying those back at a slower rate than my private sector loans, to then be able to realize I'm actually making more money, even though I'm paying less on my debt burden. I am making more in my investments. And that concept of compound interest and long-term investment is allowing me to create more complex investment streams, right? Like a portfolio that isn't like binary, as we talked before, right? Like expenses in, expenses out, how much money is coming in cash flow wise, how do I relieve my debt burden? It's not absolute. It ends up being this sort of more complex system of understanding where to allocate things given what potential returns you can get.
You make a lot of great points. I think one of the things that we don't do as a society is we don't talk enough about money. I think that if we made it a little less taboo to talk about money, the good and the bad, I think we'd all be in a better place. I'm a great example. My parents, they talked about money from the very beginning. I knew how much my dad made, roughly. I knew how much life cost, a little bit. My wife, on the other hand, they didn't talk about money at all. And it creates a different mindset. So I've always been open. Even with my kids today, they know how much I make. They know how much that trip to Disney costs. They know how much their school costs. And I think being open about that and having, as you were very fortunate at Anastasia to have a cheerleader and your partner to help you along the way. Because at the end of the day, it's really tough to do it all alone. So having that somebody that you can talk to, whether it's an advisor or otherwise, is huge. The other thing that I think that you brought up that's really important, and especially for lawyers, because, you're not against learning, obviously. So take the time to learn the basics, right? There's a lot of reading out there you can get on the internet. There's a lot of books. There's programs by the ABA that can help you learn the basics about money. Get educated. Just know the little things. Know what it takes to create a foundation for yourself. Know what, as you said, debt repayment versus savings. Compound interest, everybody talks about it. I don't think enough people know what it really does and how it can really affect things. Get familiar with the basics. And like I said, a lot of that stems from the fact that we've made it taboo to talk about money.
I think there's an example of a lawyer at some point who had retired from her big law job in her early 40s, and everybody was so excited, right? They're like, oh, I wish I could do that. And it's like looking at those kinds of examples. If you want to have that kind of freedom, what would it take for me to retire, right? So knowing what your cost of living needs to be and how much you need to live off the interest of your investments, and then sort of working back from there, right? Like, there's so many different financial models that allow you to decide what you want your future to look like, and then where you need to be financially now and how you should be investing and saving to be able to get there, right? And it was interesting. I had an alum come and talk to my students in our leadership class around pivots and sort of making non-traditional choices along their career. And one of her advice pieces was around real estate investment, making several real estate investments over time early on in your career, if you can, in different neighborhoods to create income streams. And so it was something that many of them hadn't thought about because they thought, that's a very expensive investment. And it can be, but also if you're thoughtful around neighborhoods that are growing, if you want to get rental income, if you want to get experience in something outside of just law, right? There's so many different ways to think about how to get to the destination that you want down the road and the kinds of things that you want to achieve, whether it's having a private sector job that can then finance a public sector job as you move on through your career. It is so paramount to get very practical around what the cost of that will be so that you can be successful along the way.
And I totally agree with that. I think, again, even before you get to that point, you need to go right back to the beginning, right? And figure out, where am I, right? And take a good, and this is really tough. This is really tough to do in your early 20s or late 30s. But to look 25, 30, 40 years up the road is really difficult for a lot of people. And it's going to change. Even in the years that I've been working with some of my clients, the ones that I've had for the 27, 28 years, there's been a lot of changes. I think for a lot of people and a lot of lawyers, you don't know if you're going to stay in big law forever. You don't know if you're going to be a solo practitioner forever. Maybe you are a solo practitioner that goes into big law. Maybe you're a big law lawyer that goes into solo practice. Those can all change, and those will change your trajectory, obviously. So any plan that you have has to be flexible enough to allow for a lot of that. And so the long-term vision might change along the way. That's why for me, sometimes it's difficult for a 20-odd-year-old or early 30-year-old to really envision what their retirement's going to look like. So that's why I just get them into the idea of saving by percentages, as we talked about earlier. From there, the vision might get clearer as you go along, but knowing that at 28, 30, 32, it's really tough to plan that far ahead.
Yeah, I joke with my students that many of them are trying to optimize for their future selves. And I, as someone who's mentioned before that I had a 60-year plan, 60 year by year, overdid it, right? But my big takeaway as we wrap up our conversation is that it's really important to do some of that proactive work now, which is to figure out your why, to figure out your history and psychopathy around money, what you came around with, and then get a sense for yourself about how to practically plan, given all of those buckets, including the joy bucket, right? That's a very important bucket to me, to be able to enjoy my money, not necessarily at wild amounts, right? But I want to be able to have some benefit out of that while I'm also practically investing and paying down debt and thinking about other priorities. But for law students, get educated about this stuff, because I think fundamentally you don't want your money making decisions for you in the future. You want to be able to feel a sense of confidence around the decisions that you're making in your life and the surprises that come around and the new things that you want to be able to do. And the more you understand how you make those decisions and where your money is and how it's operating in your life, the more free you're going to be able to make those decisions without pressure.
You're absolutely right. I think that too many people are reactive that way, Anastasia. And I think that if you get started early enough, you can set yourself up so that you're forging the life that you want. And I think that has to start right out of the gate, right out of law school. And it doesn't mean that you're going to have it all crystal clear where you're going to end up, but you have to have that idea that, look, I'm going to make this happen for myself. And it's funny you talk about joy, and I know we've only got a couple minutes left, but there's really three main buckets that I have people put money into. One is for their core expenses. One is for savings, and then one is a special little account I call the stuff account. And in the stuff account, that's for all the purchases that you were talking about. I want to go on that vacation. I want to buy those shoes. I want to buy that watch. It's the guilt-free spending account. And I think that the clients that I have that do that are diligent in putting money in there, getting them to wait until they have the money in that account to do it can set them so much further ahead. They don't have to justify to anybody, even themselves, for why they bought it, because that money is earmarked for. So I think that's very important. But I think that, to your point, that having a plan and knowing where you're going, I think that that's huge. The sooner you get started on the right path, The sooner you start with the right habits, the better off you're going to be. And I think that, again, not to be redundant, but that all has to start in law school. And from there, you just adapt as your life proceeds.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you for all your amazing advice. I encourage the students and listeners to follow you on LinkedIn. I think you share some very valuable and practical advice around money and a way for us to free ourselves from that binary kind of decision making and think ahead. So thank you for joining me, and that's a wrap.
Thanks for listening to How to Navigate Law School, the podcast dedicated to guiding you through the hidden rules and practical skills essential for success in law school. For additional resources, visit PLI's Law School Hub at pli.edu/law school. Please note that the views and opinions expressed during this podcast represent those of the individuals being interviewed and not necessarily those of PLI. PLI is a nonprofit learning organization dedicated to keeping attorneys and other professionals at the forefront of knowledge and expertise.